Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Vlummer. In this episode, we talk with Benjamin Matheson about various problems concerning both compatibilist and libertarian free will in heaven.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Benjamin Matheson, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Bern. Ben is currently PI of a grant on collective guilt and shame, and most of his work is focused on issues in free will, moral responsibility, and agency. But he's also written on the afterlife, and in particular about some puzzles having to do with free will in heaven, which will be our focus in this episode today. Ben co-edited with Yujin Nagasawa a book called The Palgrave Handbook of the Afterlife, which came out in 2017. And Ben has also published some articles on today's topic, including Tracing and Heavenly Freedom, which was published in the International Journal for Philosophy of Religion in 2018. And we're excited to dig into these issues today. So welcome to the show, Ben. Could you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So like you said, I've worked on various issues, but actually my first independent work in philosophy was in the philosophy of religion. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on human design arguments, and that's where my academic interest in free will came from, since part of the discussion there concerns free will. And then in my master's thesis, I started thinking about free will theodicies with respect to religious experiences. And then that made me more interested in the nature of free will, and more in particular. And my PhD was originally supposed to be a lot more on free will, and then veered more towards moral responsibility and issues about responsibility over time. And since then, I've gone more into thinking about moral responsibility and the emotions and moral psychology. But I've still always had this long-standing interest in the philosophy of religion and its connections to free will. Part of this is also, before doing philosophy, I was brought up in a very sort of semi-Catholic way. So I was brought up going to Mass. And at a certain point, I was a very hardcore libertarian about free will. And I had early arguments with friends about God and the existence of evil. And, I was making something like the free will defense, not obviously nothing sophisticated, but, giving that kind of line in response. And I'm not sure if it's because of philosophy or what, but over time, but theistic beliefs waned a little bit. And one of the main reasons was the existence of evil in the world. It became very hard for me to maintain. But at the same time, these beliefs have waxed and waned. So the stuff we're going to talk about today and the papers I discussed, I'm taking a lot more of a skeptical position with respect to tracing and heavenly freedom. But I'm quite open to various different views here. So I'm very interested to delve back into these issues and think about them more.
Yeah,
thanks.
Very cool. Many theists take free will to be very valuable, perhaps so valuable as to even justify God's allowing evil and suffering to take place. And as we discussed earlier this season in our conversation with Dan Speak, but many of those same theists believe in a personal afterlife, which we call heaven. It's a paradise, and it's not supposed to include any kind of evil or suffering. These commitments suggest several questions about the value of free will, whether we could have free will without misusing it, and so on. So could you introduce some of the background we need for thinking about free will in heaven?
Yes, I think the first way in thinking about it is just coming from a very much scriptural or theological perspective. You've learned about the afterlife and heaven, and you're interested in what it would be like, what would life, communing with God, be like? And one question there is whether you have free will. My own way into the topic was a little bit different. It was very much from mainstream philosophy of religion. And the backdrop here I take is the logical problem of evil. And I've always taken this to be the central challenge to theism, or really like a form of perfect being theism. We have an all-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful God. And so one worry you have there is like, well, if God has all these properties, why is there evil in the world? And a response that's convinced a lot of people, free will defense. So you can hold that we have, at least possibly a robust kind of free will, such that humans have enough freedom to introduce evil into the world, and as a result, God bears no culpability for it. And the thought here is that God is perfect, so he can't be the one who's responsible or culpable for evil, but he can do something. He kind of created us in such a way that we are the ones, humans in general, or a particular human was the one that brought evil into the world. And so if you take the free will defense, you just want to establish the possibility of God and evil coexisting.
Mm-hmm.
Again, most theists will want more than that. They want to know, like, well, there's evil all around me in life. How do I make sense of this? I can establish the coherence of God's existence, but I now want to establish its plausibility. And that often people say that then calls for a theodicy. Let's try and make sense of not only the existence of evil, but also its extent. Why is there so much evil? I mean, why do we need genocides? Why do we need all kinds like murder and all kinds of terrible things like that? And that's something that calls for some explanation. Like, also calls for an explanation of why can't God step in and stop all these things? Maybe he can allow people who choose to, try to commit a genocide and then go, actually, hang on a minute, you're not going to do that. Or here, let me give you a convincing case why you shouldn't. So we have to make sense of how all of that can happen. And one way is to just, well, we're not going to say, one way that you can invoke heaven here is to then say, actually, look, the world is how it is, but there's going to be an afterlife. There's going to be a paradise for those who are worthy of it, those who have resisted temptation to evil, those who have reformed and redeemed. And that afterlife is going to be so great that it's going to, in effect, compensate for the existence of evil in life. So in a way, we're not so much explaining why there's so much evil in life, but we're then thinking about, okay, it's going to be compensated in some respect. And looking back in a way, the life in heaven will be so excellent that, okay, it won't feel so bad that there was such evil in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, we've got to then think about the nature of heaven at that point, or what's happening in heaven, right? So we've thought about this, that there's so much evil in the world, and then there's going to be a life, without evil in heaven. But now if we start to talk about a place that has no evil, it starts to sound like we're describing a place that has no free will. Since when we responded to the logical problem of evil, we invoked a significant kind of freedom where we could choose between either doing good or bad things, and that's supposed to have a certain kind of value that makes it worth it for God to give us that rather than not give it to us. And we have to start to think about, well, shouldn't we have something so valuable in heaven too? But then, if we think about ourselves having that in heaven, that opens up the possibility that there's going to be evil and sin in heaven. But the way that the dialectics unfolded here is that heaven has been invoked as a place where there's no such things. So this way into it from the philosophy of religion and thinking about heavenly freedom starts to raise the issue of, well, can we make sense of, how can we make sense of free will in heaven? And I think that making sense of it is important to the theist overall project of making theism plausible. We need to have some explanation for, well, whether we have free will or not in heaven, and if we do, how do we avoid the implication that we can bring evil into heaven or sin in heaven?
Yeah, that's really helpful background. We want to talk about what free will in heaven might look like on both compatibilist and libertarian views of what free will is. We'll ask about the compatibilist free will first. If it seems like God might be able to simply determine everyone in heaven to only make good choices, only perform good actions, and yet, if we're compatibilists, this wouldn't undermine free will, or at least not necessarily. So is that right? Is that the right way to think about compatibilist free will in heaven? And what might free will in heaven look like on some particular compatibilist accounts?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if you're a compatibilist, you have a fairly easy time making sense of free will in heaven because you understand free will in a way that is compatible with determinism, either causal determinism or theological determinism.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can imagine that God creates people where they act freely by the lights of the compatibilist, and yet there's no evil. And so we might understand free will in heaven either in a psychological structuralist way, such as along the lines that Harry Frankfurt proposes. So in Frankfurt's view, you act freely and of your own free will when you have a kind of alignment between your first order desires and your second order volitions. Now, first order desires are your desires to act. So you want particular things. So you want to have a drink, you want to have something to eat, you want to be friends with somebody. A second order volition is a desire about which first order desire you want to be your will, which first order desires you want to actually move you to action. Mm-hmm. And for Frankfurt, If your second order volitions and your first order desires align, then the actions that result from your first order desires are ones that are free actions, ones that are the result of you acting freely and of your own free will. So in that picture, it's fairly easy to see how God could determine us. As long as we have the right psychological structure, then we're acting freely, and you can ensure that there's no sin, there's no evil in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Another kind of compatibilist account is a reasons responsive account. In this kind of account, you only have to be able, very roughly, you have to be able to act differently if aspects of your situation are differently. But nothing, you don't need to actually be able to do differently in the actual sequence of events. So as time passes, if things were different, you might act differently. But since things are how they are in the actual sequence, you remain, you continue to have free will as long as you are appropriately reasons responsive. And again, here, since God's determination of what happens in heaven would be in the actual sequence of events, we would continue to have free will in this view, because it's only if things were different that we would act differently. And so the compatibilist has a fairly easy time making sense of free will in heaven. Some might say a little bit too easy.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of that, one question that naturally arises for the compatibilist who thinks that we can have free will in heaven, and when we're going back to the original puzzle, is why didn't God create the world this way from the get-go without all the wrongdoing that we see? So could you elaborate on this objection?
So we can sum up this objection as follows, why go through all the trouble of creating this world? You could just have skipped straight ahead to the world without evil. Why not make our ante-mortem existence one where there's no evil and yet people still act freely? Why have any evil in the world at all? I think, one response that compatibilists can give here is to appeal to what is sometimes called a soul-making theodicy. And the thought here with the soul-making theodicy is that evil in the world is there to help develop our characters. It's a way of testing us, of developing us, and making us better by encountering things which are bad and even evil. And I think that's plausible as far as it goes, but it's hard to then see why we need so much evil. Perhaps we can develop our characters with, a little bit less evil or a little bit. It's hard to see why the amount of evil in the world is what's necessary to do, help develop our souls, our characters. I think that's going to remain a challenge. Even if you can make good sense of the soul-making theodicy, there's still going to be the challenge of explaining why there's so much evil and not just what seems like plausibly enough to help develop your characters.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, let's turn to libertarian views of free will. And suppose we accept libertarianism, and so we take freedom to be incompatible with determinism, including kind of theological or divine determinism. What problems arise if we hold that human beings retain libertarian free will in heaven, the afterlife?
The problem with holding this is you then have to explain why people don't perform evil acts in heaven. If we're assuming that they have libertarian free will, and that implies a kind of significant freedom where they can choose between good and bad options, we need to have some understanding of why they're not just choosing the bad options rather than the good. Why are we now, after death in heaven, always choosing the good options? If that was possible, we could have surely done that ante-mortem as well. But why is it in heaven that evil acts are completely closed off? And since the libertarian wants to make sense of how we have libertarian free will in heaven, it seems like they have to make sense of this. If they go down the route of saying that we cannot even perform evil acts, we have to explain that as well, because that risks sounding like we don't have libertarian free will. So the challenge there is to explain either how we can we can perform evil acts but just don't choose to, or explain why we don't even have the ability to perform evil acts.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, one response libertarians might make is to point to the distinction between direct freedom and indirect freedom. And so they might say something like, well, human beings in heaven aren't directly free, but maybe they're indirect, or their freedom is more indirect. So the key idea is that so long as there's some point at which humans are directly free, then their freedom in heaven derives from or traces back to those directly free actions. So could you spell out this idea of tracing and indirect and direct freedom and explain how theists have appealed to it in their account of heavenly freedom?
Yeah, I think it's before getting to direct and indirect freedom, I think it's important to start with the distinction between direct and indirect responsibilities. So I think it's this distinction which is much more intuitively plausible and I think overall, much more natural. So tracing here is often used to explain why we would still hold a drunk driver morally responsible. So suppose a person drives whilst drunk and injures someone. We suppose that they lack control and knowledge at the time. They were sufficiently drunk, sufficiently intoxicated. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't have sufficient control such that they're directly responsible for what they did. But we don't excuse people for that. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because we can ground their responsibility for drunk driving on an earlier decision of theirs, the consequence of which was them driving whilst drunk. So we look back at the time they chose to get drunk and say, well, did they exercise control then? Did they know what they're doing? Was it reasonably foreseeable to them that they would, drive whilst drunk? If all of that's true, they're directly responsible for their choice to get drunk, and then they can be indirectly or derivatively responsible for actually driving whilst drunk. So that's one kind of case where you might think of the distinction between direct and indirect responsibility. Another kind of case, which is going to be more relevant to the theist and thinking about heavenly freedom, is cases of character setting. So you might have a case where somebody decides to form their character such that they're closed off from doing something in the future. So you might suppose a person engages in a project of character development to reconcile with their friend. And so at the earlier time, they go, look, I never want to wrong my friend like this ever again. I want to make up to him and apologize and repent and atone. So they develop their character such that engaging in that particular kind of action is closed off to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there might be a later time where they, otherwise would have had the choice to engage in that wrongful behavior again, but they don't. Now, I think we wouldn't want to say that the person lacks responsibility for doing the right thing because they've made themselves into the kind of person that kind of action is closed off to them. So it's not only responsible for what they did, but also commendable. And so we can explain this in terms of tracing again. We can say that the fact that they chose to do the right thing at a later time can be derived or traced back to their earlier choice to develop their character such that the wrongdoing was closed off to them. So even though they lack the ability to do otherwise at a later time, they lack the ability to do anything other than the good thing, to not engage in the wrongful conduct, that's traced back to their earlier decision to engage in this project. Now, drawing on this kind of reasoning, theists can make sense of a kind of freedom in heaven. They can say, well, look, so the person who develops their character, the theist can say, well, they not only have indirect responsibility for choosing to do the good thing later in life, but they're also indirectly free. And they're indirectly free because they earlier were directly free in setting their character. And the theist here can appeal to similar kind of reasoning to explain freedom in heaven. They can say, look, people in heaven can't sin or act in any kind of evil way, but that doesn't mean they lack freedom completely. They still have indirect freedom. These are the kinds of people who've committed themselves to God and becoming better people, such that by the time they've entered heaven, doing evil things and sinning is completely closed off to them.
Mm-hmm.
But earlier in life, sinning and performing evil acts was open to them. They've just developed their characters in such a way that it's completely closed off to them later in life. So similar to the person who develops their character to reconcile with a friend, people in heaven continue to have a kind of indirect freedom, which is traceable back to their earlier direct freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's helpful. And this isn't some kind of weird add-on to standard libertarian views. Lots of libertarians like Robert Kane and others have talked about indirectly free actions modeled in this kind of way. The drunk driving case is one kind of standard example, but Kane has that famous discussion of Martin Luther famously saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other," but he thinks he could be responsible, even if that's literally true, that he didn't have libertarian freedom this time, couldn't do otherwise. So this is an interesting model for how you could have freedom in heaven that sort of traces back to the ante-mortem state when libertarian free will might really be direct libertarian free will might be possessed. But in your paper that I mentioned earlier, Tracing and Heavenly Freedom, you give some objections to this tracing strategy. So could you explain your objection to this approach?
So I have two problems, one minor, one major. And the minor one is that I worry that there's a shift in the reasoning. So in the explanation I gave before, I was focused much on examples of responsibility, on indirect and direct responsibility. To me, that seems like a very plausible distinction that most responsibilities, like a plausible theory of responsibility can include.
Yeah.
But I've never quite seen the motivation for then talking about direct and indirect freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems, okay, so we have all these cases where, okay, it's plausible that drunk driver is responsible in some sense. It's plausible that Luther is responsible in some sense when he says, here I stand, I can do no other. But it's not obvious to me that they're free, at least not in a very significant way. It
Right.
seems like a strange way to use the terms here. And I worry that there's a bit of a slip where we go, oh, it's freedom, so it must be very valuable, it must be very good. It must be something that's almost on a par with direct freedom, but that's not quite right, because in a way that it's really not the same kind of freedom. It's like I guess the term is indirect for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Again, I think that perhaps can be motivated in some way. I'm just not familiar with anyone that's given a very compelling story for why we should think that freedom is involved in these cases and not just responsibility.
Right.
Of course, if you're appealing to tracing in your account of heavenly freedom, I think it's something you do have to try and make a bit more sense of. My bigger worry, however, concerns the value of derivative freedom or indirect freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the response to the problem of evil is that we've got this libertarian free will, which is so significant that we can choose between good and bad options, and we have to have this because that's what's valuable. That's what's valuable for us to have. So I contend in this paper that part of the value of choosing between these options is it gives us the ability to change our mind. So when we can choose between good and bad options, we can, at that point, we're able to go, I'm going to take the good path or I'm going to take the bad path. And we often see this as being plausible in cases where we've got somebody who's chosen the bad path in life, and we always seem to want to leave open that there's a way for them to repent and redeem. And so in the example I gave earlier, the person wants to reconcile with their friend and redeem themselves and atone. And so at that point, they may have taken all the bad choices for a long time in their life. But at some point, they can just go, right, I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to go the other way. I'm going to move away from evil, from badness, and choose to do good things, to repair relationships with people. We're also familiar with lots of the opposite kind of cases. So if you've watched Breaking Bad, you're familiar with Walter White.
Right.
He's a good guy, a regular guy, and then he starts making these bad choices, and he gets further down, deeper and deeper. And I think we're thinking about the libertarian free will, and I think that what's this significant freedom between choosing between good and bad things, we're always able to go back. Okay, we can always go, okay, we've gone down the good path, but we can always fall, go down to the bad path. We've gone down the bad path, we can always redeem ourselves and get back onto the good path. And whether you take the story literally or not, in the paper I discuss how Lucifer is thought to have fallen by performing the first sin, the primal sin. And when we're thinking about this kind of action, that's the introduction of evil into the world. And we were given this ability to have something so valuable that we could have brought evil into the world, and we did. And I worry that if we're imagining that that's so valuable, that I think it's troublesome to me. I find it difficult to see how we can use our significant freedom to then close ourselves off from significant freedom in the future.
Mm-hmm.
If it's so significant, it should always be open to us. It should be something that, okay, we've taken all the bad options. Even if you're Lucifer and you've gone down the bad path, the good path should be open to you. Or, more weakly, Walter White there should still be that possibility for redemption for him, and vice versa. It seems like people who've taken the good choices, there's always going to be that possibility, no matter how slim, that they can go down the bad path again. And that's what makes significant free will, seems to me, what makes it so valuable. And here in the paper, I compare significant freedom, libertarian free will, to political freedom. So I argue that part of what makes political freedom so valuable is it gives you the freedom to change your mind when you vote in elections, and democratic and free and fair elections. You vote for a candidate, but you can always go back and change your mind later on. There's always that room to go back. And I think that's part of what makes political freedom valuable. And I think that's also part of what makes libertarian significant freedom valuable, is that there's this ability to go back on yourself. And the worry with thinking about heaven without the significant freedom is I start to wonder whether significant freedom is now so valuable after all in this picture. Because you're saying people are in heaven and they have free will, and presumably it's supposed to be as valuable as, the indirect freedom that people have is supposed to be as valuable as the direct freedom, significant freedom people had ante-mortem. But I struggle to see the worry that is that, you're invoking this as being a valuable kind, but that seems to make the earlier kind look less valuable, because you're able to lose it. You're able to lose the ability to change your mind and to, go from one path, and the good path, to the bad path, and vice versa.
Yeah. So I guess the basic idea, at least part of your objection, is, well, heaven's supposed to be the thing that includes all of the value. Anything that's the most valuable should be in heaven. And if free will is that valuable to allow so much pain and suffering, then it seems like, or at least direct freedom, seems like we need to have that in heaven too.
Yeah,
And that opens us up to the original worry with libertarian free will, is this possibility of falling away or
yeah,
making bad choices.
yeah, definitely. That's a nice way of putting it. That you're in the free will, in your response to the logical problem of evil, you've appealed to the sense of significant freedom that's supposedly so valuable that it can bring evil into the world. But now we're supposed to imagine this, this wonderful place of, one way of thinking about it is even the greatest possible place where you convene with the greatest possible being. And yet, the kind of freedom you have there is limited. You haven't got the ability to, change path in life, to go from the good to the bad. You're just on the good, and you've in fact used that freedom, which was apparently so valuable, to close yourself off from the future possibility of changing your mind and going away from the path.
Yeah. So what are some other positions somebody might be able to adopt on this issue of free will in heaven if we give up the tracing strategy?
So one option, which I actually touched on another paper of mine called Escaping Heaven, is to just hold that there might at least be attempts to perform evil acts in heaven. But this gets people thrown out of heaven. And I think that's not going to be very satisfying to a lot of theists, because again, for a similar kind of reasoning, you might think, well, isn't this supposed to be the greatest possible place where we convene with the greatest possible being? It's like, why would then evil happen in here? And I think this suggests that there's a difficulty in making sense of how freedom in heaven can work. So on the one hand, we're pushed towards thinking of it as, we wouldn't want the greatest possible place to be a place where there's evil, but we also want it to have significant freedom. So I think it's also just maybe not going to be very satisfying if you come from a more scriptural, theological background, because you may not want the ante-mortem existence. You may not want your post-mortem existence to be just like your ante-mortem existence, where there can be evil and there can be a fall between good and bad. I mean, when you think of it from one side, you're pushed towards thinking, well, you want to have all this value, all this valuable freedom, this significant freedom. But then looking at it another way, it's like, well, actually, no, we don't want this here. And so I think taking that option of thinking that you can be thrown out of heaven creates a tension, and I think it's not easily resolvable. I think another, and this is the one that I'm much more tempted towards, which perhaps in some ways is more radical, is to deny or reject a perfect being theology, to say, well, actually, maybe, for example, God's not all powerful. Maybe he's all good and all knowing, but not all powerful. And this would then explain why there might be evil in heaven. God's just not powerful enough to stop it, right? I mean, and that might also explain why there's evil in the world. God's just not powerful enough to stop it. Again, I think for some it's going to be too radical, because they would want to hold that God is all powerful.
Right.
I've long held that this would be the solution to a lot of the theist problem, including the problem of heavenly freedom, is that, I think if you come from a theistic background, you at least want God to be all good. That seems to be the most important trait. But all powerful and all knowing, I think they could be weakened and you could still maintain the same overall picture. Of course, that's then going to collide with those who want to endorse some version of the ontological argument and say that God's the greatest possible being. But perhaps that's just one of the costs that you're going to have to accept to create an overall plausible picture. But I appreciate, again, that that's not going to be satisfying for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like many of the things we talk about on this podcast, it looks like any option you go, there's some kind of cost,
Yeah,
theoretical
totally.
cost or lingering puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah. One solution I was thinking about was, it seems like what the theist should say is something like, well, our ability to choose wrongly with libertarian free will in this life maybe is a defect because we're mistaken about the good. And so maybe the right response is to say, well, once they're in heaven, then they're not going to be mistaken about the good. But then it seems like that runs you back into the problem that the compatibilist was facing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what you're thinking here is that why didn't God just create us to not be confused
Yeah.
about the good in the first place?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's always going to be a worry. And I think if you take the libertarian route as well, one of the worries that you're going to get is that, I touch upon this in my paper as well, is that if you look at discussions of primal sin, and Kevin Timpe in his book on free will and philosophical theology has a very good discussion of this, is that he thinks it's ultimately going to be quite mysterious how evil came into the world, like in the primal sin.
Yeah.
And the worry I have here is you're a libertarian and you give me all these plausible stories about how we have indirect freedom, and I suppose I buy all of that. I'm still going to worry that the mystery, if it was mysterious how evil got into the world in the first place, despite how we were created, I worry about the mystery popping back up later on. And when I've discussed this with theists, and it's also included in Tim Pay's work, is distinguishes between these different stages of existence. Again, the worry is that if it's mysterious in the earlier stage, I don't know what mystery I don't know how we've closed off the mystery later on.
Yeah.
And again, we maybe get back into this worry that we would fall into what a very compatibilist looking picture where we wonder why wouldn't God just have, if we could close off the possibility of evil in heaven, why couldn't you have closed off the possibility later on? I think that's, a worry for a lot of these responses, is that you start off with libertarian free will, which is so intrinsically valuable, and in response to problems, you become more and more compatibilist seeming, and then you soon inherit the problems of the compatibilist responses. And then maybe you're pushed back the other way and you go back into the problems for the libertarian. But yeah, I mean, there's one reason why I think that the more radical option of thinking of God as not being all-powerful is a way to solve a lot of problems here, including problems of heavenly freedom. Again, it's not satisfying. It's a cost. It's a very costly option, but it does seem to get around a lot of worries. And a question whether it's going to be satisfying for particular people of particular religious backgrounds. But it's a project there to see how compatible or not it would be with your religious convictions.
Yeah.
It's at least a solution to the logical problem to say that, well, it's there's a coherent option out there. Whether or not anybody's actually going to go for it is another question.
Yeah, definitely.
I think even the step for traditional theists who want to keep, omnipotence with the other divine attributes, this conversation puts some pressure to look for other things to say about evil other than just the value of free will. And that's something that came up even just in our earlier discussions about free will and the problem of evil, is it looks like almost everyone is going to have to say something in addition to free will, even though a lot of theists will kind of initially, as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to the problem of evil, say something about human free will and its value.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things, I'm just speaking personally, even if I wasn't giving like the free will defense as Plantinga gives it, people often appeal to this, but then not having a wider theodicy is something that then can then pick away, and it can chip away at your resilience and thinking, actually, so without that wider project, I think it's something that you've got the coherence, but that only gets you so far. You really need to say something more about evil in the world. But then there's how plausible the options are there. the soul-making theodicy, I think, is plausible as far as it goes, but then we can't make sense of it's harder to make sense of the extent of evil.
Yeah.
And I think appealing to heaven is some sort of almost compensatory mechanism. It's a little unsatisfying too, because it seems like it's diminishing evil a little bit. Because, you know, you think of this perspective long into the future, long into your postmortem existence, and you're looking back at what happened, and it seems very minor.
Mm-hmm.
It seems a little, at least, disrespectful to people who may be suffering from horrendous and great evils, to then think that it's going to be so diminished. Perhaps it's true, but I think it's not really helping people who are going through that, or people who see the threat that these pose to their wider theistic beliefs.
Yeah, that's a nice point. Well, thanks so much, Ben. It's been nice to chat about free will and heaven and these related issues, especially about the problem of evil. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
I mean, two places. First, my personal website. I think if you search my name and it should Benjamin Matheson and philosophy, I should come up. Or you can go into Phil Papers and you can find my work there. I think all my papers are on Phil Papers. So I think everything, you know, all my work on moral responsibility, on tracing heavenly freedom, work on responsibility over time, and various other topics, you can find it all there.
Yeah, very cool. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
In our next episode, which will be the last one of this season, we'll talk about sin and free will, and our guest will be Lee Weissens, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Augustana University.